Winston Churchill is remembered as the indomitable leader who stood firm when Britain's survival hung in the balance. His words steeled a nation, his resolve inspired the free world, and his name has been etched into history as a symbol of courage and determination. Yet while Churchill could rally millions against tyranny, he could not protect his own family from sorrow. Behind the grandeur of the war rooms and the glow of public adoration lay a quieter, more complicated story, the story of his 5 children. To the outside world, they were the offspring of greatness, blessed with privilege, education, and opportunity. But in reality, the Churchill children grew up under immense pressure, facing struggles of their own that fame and fortune could never erase. Some found purpose and achievement. Others lost their way to heartbreak and tragedy. Randolph, the only son, bore the impossible weight of being Winston's heir, brilliant in flashes but undone by personal demons. Mary, the youngest, became her father's pride, carving a respected life of service and stability. Sarah sought her stage in acting and art, but wrestled with turbulent relationships. Diana, the firstborn, carried both affection from her father and painful distance from her mother, leaving her torn between pride and fragility. And little Marigold, the child whose life was cut tragically short, left a wound on Winston and Clementine's hearts that never fully healed. Together, their stories reveal that the Churchill legacy was not confined to speeches and battlefields, but was also lived and often suffered within the family home. The triumphs and trials of Randolph Mary, Sarah Diana, and Marigold remind us that even the children of giants walk uncertain paths, caught between privilege and pressure, admiration and expectation. This is not just the story of Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister. It is the story of Winston Churchill, the father. A man whose children loved him, struggled under him, and in their own ways tried to make peace with the towering shadow of his name. Number 5. Diana Churchill. Born in 1909, Diana arrived when Winston was a rising political star, and he was delighted that his firstborn was a girl. He gushed to friends that baby Diana was the image of me. Little Diana grew up adored by her father, perhaps even spoiled by him, and educated by a string of nannies and governesses. She was a shy and sensitive girl who often felt overshadowed by her parents' busy lives. While Winston was affectionate with Diana, her relationship with her mother Clementine was more strained. Clementine's sharp criticisms, even if well-intended, wounded Diana's tender heart. As a young woman, Diana became a sort of quiet support companion to her father. Whenever her mother was away or unwell, Diana would accompany Winston to events, cheering him up and sharing his interest in politics. She had her father's love, but society in that era had limited expectations for women. So Winston never really considered Diana as a political heir on account of her sex. As one biographer noted, this unspoken limitation may have left Diana wondering about her own purpose. In the 1930s, Diana did what was expected of a woman of her class. She married and started a family. Her first marriage, however, was unhappy and short-lived. At 23, she wed John Milner Bailey, the heir to a baronetcy, in 1932, but they divorced only a few years later. In 1935, Diana married a second time to Duncan Sandys, a rising conservative politician who was a close supporter of Winston. For a while, this seemed promising. Diana and Duncan had 3 children together, and Diana immersed herself in the role of mother and political wife. During World War II, while her siblings were in uniform, Diana served on the home front in a different way. She joined the Red Cross and worked for charities, and also briefly held a commission in the Naval Services, the WRNS. Yet behind her dutiful exterior, Diana was fighting in her battles. She suffered nervous breakdowns at several points in her adult life. The pressures of raising children during wartime and being Winston Churchill's daughter, constantly in the public eye, weighed heavily on her fragile psyche. By 1960, Diana's marriage to Duncan Sandys had fallen apart. They divorced after 25 years together. Sandys' political career, he later became a minister, had often kept him away, and there were strains that never healed. After the divorce, Diana, now in her early 50s, found herself adrift. She tried to find meaning through helping others. In 1962, she even began volunteering with the Samaritans, a suicide prevention charity, as if determined to save others from the darkness she knew too well. It's heartbreaking to note that while Diana was comforting distressed strangers on the telephone, she was privately sinking deeper into depression. She remained extremely close to Winston, and he was supportive during her mental health struggles. She once said her father was her greatest comfort in times of despair. But even a father's love couldn't cure clinical depression. Tragedy struck the Churchill family on October 20th, 1963. That day, Diana Churchill took her own life, overdosing on barbiturate sleeping pills at her London home. She was only 54 years old. A coroner's inquest ruled her death a suicide, noting that she had been suffering from acute barbiturate poisoning, self-administered. The news devastated Winston and Clementine. No parent should outlive their child. Winston was frail and nearing the end of his own life. He would die barely 15 months later, in January 1965. And losing Diana plunged him into grief. Diana's 3 children lost their mother, and the family closed ranks to protect them from the media. In that era, suicide often went whispered, but Diana's death made headlines around the world. Many who only knew her as Churchill's daughter were shocked to learn of the pain she carried. Those closer to her were saddened, but perhaps not surprised. They knew of her long-standing bouts with depression and breakdowns. Diana Churchill was laid to rest at St. Martin's Church in Blaydon, Oxfordshire, in the Churchill family plot. There she lies with her famous parents and later with her siblings. It is poignant to think that Diana's grave now literally lies in the shadow of Winston Churchill's, symbolizing a life spent in the shadow of a great man. Number 4. Randolph Churchill. Born in 1911, Randolph was raised to regard himself as his father's political heir. Winston doted on young Randolph and indulged him even as the boy misbehaved terribly. In fact, family friends recall that Randolph could be charming one moment and impossible the next. A child so unruly, he would confess to misdeeds he didn't commit just to show he didn't fear punishment. Churchill adored his son and envisioned him following in his footsteps, once remarking that all his own ambitions for Randolph were boundless. But this indulgence was a double-edged sword. Randolph grew up spoiled by privilege, and the pressure of living up to a hero like Winston was immense. As a young man, Randolph charged headlong into politics. He stood for Parliament multiple times in the 1930s, often against his father's advice, and even caused Winston embarrassment by splitting votes. At last, in 1940, Randolph did win a seat as a member of Parliament, but it took 4 tries. By then, World War II was raging, and Randolph also served as an army officer. He participated in daring missions in North Africa and Yugoslavia alongside guerrilla fighters. Randolph was brave to the point of recklessness. He craved the chance to prove himself. His combat exploits even earned him a recommendation for a military cross, though wary of appearing partial to the great Winston's son. The brass awarded him a lesser honor instead. Back home, however, Randolph's personal battles were just as intense. He had inherited much of his father's intelligence and oratorial talent, but also Winston's temper. Without Winston's charm, those who knew Randolph often saw the worst of Winston's traits magnified. He could be bombastic, cruel, and notoriously hot-tempered. Even his father, in a moment of candor, reportedly quipped, "I love Randolph, but I don't like him." That heartbreaking remark reveals the strain in their relationship. Winston's boundless ambition for his son had soured into disappointment, as Randolph's ego and drinking made him increasingly difficult to tolerate. Friends and family whispered that Randolph was his own worst enemy. Randolph's personal life was turbulent as well. He married twice, first to socialite Pamela Digby in 1939, and later to June Osborne. Both marriages ended in divorce. He had 2 children, including Winston Churchill's namesake grandson, but domestic happiness eluded him. By the 1950s and 60s, Randolph had developed a reputation for rudeness and heavy drinking. He could commandeer any dinner table conversation only to alienate everyone present. His boorish behavior became legendary. The writer Evelyn Waugh once joked after Randolph survived a health scare that doctors had cut out the only part of Randolph that isn't malignant. a caustic quip that nonetheless reflected how many viewed him. Behind such dark humor lay a sad reality. Randolph was burning himself out. After World War II, Randolph's political career stalled. He lost his parliament seat in 1945 and never won elected office again. The Churchill name, it turned out, could open doors, but not keep them open. Yet if Randolph struggled in politics, he found his calling with the pen. He had a genuine flair for writing, much like his father. Randolph became a successful journalist and author, pouring his energies into preserving his father's story. In the 1960s, he achieved a feat that suited his talents. He wrote the first 2 massive volumes of the official biography of Winston Churchill, each nearly 1,000 pages. For all their conflicts, Randolph idolized his father and wanted to cement Winston's legacy in print. He worked obsessively on a 3rd volume, A Race Against Time, as his own health failed. Years of hard drinking had ravaged Randolph's body. Doctors warned him that if he didn't quit alcohol, he'd be dead within 6 months. Randolph actually heeded the warning and stopped cold turkey. An impressive show of willpower, but by then, the damage was done. In June 1968, Randolph Churchill died at age 57, only 3 years after Winston's passing. The exact cause was hard to pinpoint. One physician remarked that he's worn out every organ in his body at the same time. Randolph had lived fast and hard under the shadow of a giant. He never became the statesman his father hoped for, but he carved out his own legacy as a writer and keeper of the Churchill flame. Number 3, Sarah Churchill. Born in 1914, Winston's 3rd child who blazed her own trail on the stage and in life. Sarah was a natural rebel from the start, so stubborn that her father nicknamed her Mule. She had a vivacious personality and a flair for the dramatic, quite literally. Against her parents' initial wishes, Sarah pursued a career as an actress and dancer, making her debut in a London West End chorus line at age 21. To the shock of Winston and Clementine, 22-year-old Sarah then eloped in 1936 with a man they greatly disapproved of, a Vic Oliver, a comedian nearly twice her age. The Churchills were horrified. Winston fumed that Oliver was common as dirt, but Sarah's mind was set. This was the first of several bold and sometimes ill-fated choices Sarah would make in love and life. Sarah's acting career steadily gained momentum, and eventually, even her parents came to accept their daughter's profession. In fact, Winston rather admired Sarah's talent and independence despite their clashes over her personal life. By the 1940s, Sarah had proven herself on stage in London and New York. And after the war, she even cracked Hollywood. Her most famous role came in 1951 when she starred opposite the legendary Fred Astaire in the MGM musical Royal Wedding. There she was dancing with Astaire on the silver screen, a shining moment that delighted her father and showed the world that a Churchill could shine outside of politics. Sarah also had her own TV show briefly and appeared in several British films. She was beautiful, outgoing, and seemed to have the world at her feet. But Sarah's story had darker chapters too. Like her siblings, she answered the call during World War II, joining the Women's Auxiliary Air Force WAF and serving in photo intelligence units. She even accompanied Winston as an aide to the Tann and Yalta conferences, proving her devotion to her father and country. However, peace on the home front was harder for Sarah to secure. Her marriage to Vic Oliver ended in divorce in 1945. In 1949, she remarried to photographer Anthony Beauchamp, but this too ended tragically. They separated and Beauchamp died of an overdose of sleeping pills in 1957, an apparent suicide born of their unhappy split. Sarah's 3rd marriage in 1962 seemed more hopeful. She wed Lord Thomas Audley, the love of her life, and her family finally approved of her choice. But fate was cruel. Lord Audley died of a heart attack only a year later in 1963, leaving Sarah widowed and heartbroken. To make it worse, just months after Sarah lost her husband, her beloved older sister Diana died by suicide, compounding the family tragedy. By her 50s, the vivacious Sarah was facing her demons. She had no children of her own to comfort her, and her career had slowed. Her personal motto became, "Never worry, it might not happen." But privately, she struggled. Friends feared Sarah had a self-destructive streak. She began drinking heavily, and soon the lively party girl was sliding into alcoholism. There were embarrassing headlines about Sarah's arrests for drunk driving and disorderly conduct in 1959 and 1960. The Churchill charm that had carried her through so much could not mask the toll of her addiction. Still, Sarah remained warmly regarded by those close to her, and she tried to channel her pain into creative outlets, writing poetry and publishing a memoir titled A Thread in the Tapestry in 1967. In her final years, Sarah found a measure of calm. She outlived her father Winston by nearly 2 decades and was a familiar friendly figure at Churchill family gatherings, often regaling her nieces and nephews with theater stories. Yet her health was declining, weakened by years of alcohol use. Sarah passed away in September 1982 at the age of 67. The official cause was an unspecified internal condition, but it was no secret that her body had been worn down over time. She was laid to rest at St. Martin's Church in Blaydon alongside her parents. Number 2, Marigold Churchill. Born on November 15, 1918, just a week after World War I ended. She arrived in a time of hope and celebration. Her birth came days after the armistice. Anne Winston affectionately nicknamed her Duckadilly. By all accounts, Marigold was a bright, loving toddler who brought sunshine into her father's day. Winston wrote proudly that little Marigold would toddle into his room every morning to check on him, taking great interest in everything around her. To a father often consumed by affairs of state, this sweet child was a delightful distraction. The Churchills adored Duckadilly and doted on her, perhaps trying to make up for the time they couldn't spend with their older children. But fate dealt a cruel blow. In August 1921, when Marigold was not yet 3 years old, she fell seriously ill with what seemed like a cold that worsened alarmingly. It turned into meningitis and then sepsis, a deadly blood infection. Despite doctors' efforts, Marigold's tiny body could not fight off the infection. On August 23, 1921, Marigold Churchill died just a month shy of her 3rd birthday. Winston and Clementine were shattered by the loss of their golden-haired little girl. At the time, Winston was away on political travel. Clementine had been caring for Marigold and frantically called him home when things took a dire turn. He rushed back but arrived too late, a tragedy that haunted him with guilt. The family held a small funeral, and Marigold was initially buried at Kensal Green Cemetery in London. Winston, known for his stoicism, wept openly for his daughter. For years afterward, he could hardly speak of Marigold. When he did, his eyes would fill with tears. Clementine never fully recovered from the heartbreak either. How could any mother life had to go on for the Churchills? And indeed, just over a year later, in September 1922, another baby girl, Mary, was born to the family. Mary grew up never knowing Marigold, but the family kept Marigold's memory alive in subtle ways. A portrait on a wall, a mention in letters. Yet for decades, Marigold's resting place remained separate from the rest of the family, who were eventually interred at Blaydon near the Churchill ancestral home. It wasn't until much later that this was revisited. In the early 2000s and 10s, Mary SS, now Lady SS Marigold's only surviving sibling by then, began to push to have Marigold reinterred with the rest of the family at Blaydon. Mary felt strongly that the little girl's place was with her parents and siblings, so they would all be together in posterity. Moving a grave after so many years is no simple matter. And indeed, it took a lengthy legal process, even after Mary S. passed away in 2014. Finally, in 2020, Marigold's remains were exhumed from Kensal Green and laid to rest at St. Martin's Church in Blaydon, Oxfordshire. Now at long last, Marigold lies with her family. Touchingly, she shares a headstone with her sister Sarah, who had died in 1982. The simple inscription reunites the sisters in death. Back in Kensal Green, Marigold's original headstone remains as a listed monument, a quiet reminder of her short life. Visitors there still see the name Marigold Churchill and often leave flowers, even though she no longer rests beneath it. In Blaydon, one can imagine Winston and Clementine finally at peace, with their Duckadilly by their side once more. Number 1. Mary SS. Born in 1922, Mary was the youngest of the Churchill children, and by all accounts widely held to have had the happiest life of them all. She grew up at Chartwell, the Churchill country home, almost like an only child since her nearest sibling was 8 years older. While her elder brother and sisters were packed off with governesses and boarding schools, Mary enjoyed a more peaceful, idyllic childhood in the countryside. Her nanny, a cousin of her mother Clementine, doted on her, and Mary later recalled her youth as an Arcadian bliss filled with pets' gardens and distinguished visitors dropping by. Perhaps because she was spared some of the intense pressure that weighed on the older Churchills, Mary grew up well-adjusted and grounded. When World War II broke out, teenage Mary was determined to do her part with or without her parents' permission. In 1941, at just 18, she snuck off to join the Auxiliary Territorial Service ATS, the Women's Army Unit, without telling her father. Winston, ever protective of the baby of the family, was stunned by Mary's independent streak. But Mary proved herself. She served in anti-aircraft battery units around London during the Blitz, enduring nights in cold, muddy camps as bombs fell. A far cry from her privileged upbringing. She even laughed off hardships. One story tells of Mary teasing an American GI about his big feet, who promptly tossed her over his knee and gave her playful whacks. Mary just grinned and took it with Churchillian pluck. Her comrades said she was a regular guy who could take rough joking just like her dad. Mary's war service didn't end there. She also accompanied Winston as his aide-de-camp to vital conferences like Potsdam in 1945, sitting in the room with Stalin and Truman as history unfolded. Through it all, Mary showed courage and humility, never trading on her name for special treatment. After the war, Mary's life took a happier turn. In 1947, she married Christopher SS, a dashing army officer, later a respected politician and diplomat. This was no arranged marriage or aristocratic match. In fact, Winston at one point had fancifully hoped Mary might marry into royalty. But Mary followed her heart instead. The marriage was a genuine love match. Together, Mary and Christopher raised 5 children and formed a true partnership. As Christopher's career blossomed, he eventually served as a member of Parliament, the last governor of Rhodesia, and ambassador to France. Mary was his rock. She adapted to the life of a diplomat's wife with ease, charming everyone from constituents in rural England to foreign leaders at Parisian dinner parties. Friends describe Mary as gracious, energetic, and down-to-earth, much like her father Winston, but with her mother Clementine's elegance. Unlike some of her siblings, Mary thrived in her role outside the limelight of direct politics. Mary Churchill was often seen as the child who succeeded where her siblings struggled, finding a way to live in the shadow of her father's immense legacy without being consumed by it. She managed to weave together a quiet life of family service and eventually authorship, showing that the Churchill name could be carried with dignity and balance. Her literary career came late, almost by accident, but it revealed talents that had always been there. In 1979, her biography of her mother Clementine Churchill introduced her as a writer of skill and warmth. Readers found in her prose both honesty and affection, and the book's success opened the door to a second act she hadn't planned. Over the years, she produced several volumes, from collections of her father's letters to her moving memoir, A Daughter's Tale, in 2011. In doing so, she became not only a preserver of family history, but a storyteller in her own right, offering future generations an intimate portrait of life behind the headlines. Mary's life was not confined to books. She stepped into the cultural life of Britain, most notably as chair of the National Theatre in the 1980s, a role that surprised critics, but one she carried out with determination and care. She lent her voice and energy to numerous causes, many linked to her father's memory, but also to charities and institutions she believed in deeply. In time, she became something rare in her family, a beloved public figure not for scandal or controversy, but for steadiness, kindness, and thoughtful service. By the time she passed away in May 2014, at the age of 91, Mary had outlived all her siblings and become the final living link to Winston and Clementine Churchill's children. Tributes came swiftly, praising her not only as the last Churchill daughter, but as a remarkable woman in her own right, a devoted daughter, a loving mother and grandmother, an accomplished writer, and a patriot who left her own quiet mark on British cultural life. Her story proves that a famous name need not be a burden. For Mary, it was a responsibility, yes, but also an opportunity to illuminate the past with clarity, to serve the present with grace, and to inspire the future with dignity. In the end, her greatest legacy may not be her books or her public work, but the example she set that even under the weight of history, it is possible to live fully, authentically, and well.